The sun hung low over the rolling hills of St. Clair, casting a golden glow across the endless rows of lavender that defined the Moreau family's world. It was late August 1982, the peak of harvest season in this small Provençal village in southern France, and the air buzzed with the sharp, sweet scent of the purple blooms. Sophie Moreau, a wiry 10-year-old with dark curls tumbling over her shoulders, knelt among the plants, her small hands snipping stalks with a pair of rusty shears. Her fingers moved quickly, though not as fast as they had in summers past. Today a strange heaviness tugged at her limbs, a quiet ache she couldn't explain. Around her the field stretched like a violet sea, rippling gently in the warm breeze. Bees hummed lazily, darting from flower to flower, their drone blending with the distant tolling of the church bells from Notre Dame de St. Clair. The stone steeple stood tall against the horizon, a sentinel over the village's tiled rooftops and winding lanes. Sophie paused to wipe sweat from her brow, her blue eyes squinting against the sun. She loved this time of year. The way the lavender painted the landscape, the promise of her mother's flour-infused bread after a long day's work. It was a simple life, rooted in the rhythms of St. Clair, where faith and family were as steady as the earth beneath her feet. "Sophie, don't dawdle," her mother, Madame Juliette, called from a few rows over. She stood with her apron tied tightly around her waist, its faded floral pattern streaked with dirt. Her voice carried a soft Provençal lilt as she sang an old folk tune, her hands gathering bundles of lavender with practiced ease. "The sun won't wait, and neither will Monsieur Dubois at the market." "Yes, maman," Sophie replied, her voice bright despite the fatigue creeping into her bones. She pushed herself harder, snipping another stalk and adding it to the basket at her side. Her mother's song floated over the fields, a melody about a shepherd girl lost in the hills, and it wrapped around Sophie like a warm blanket. Madame Juliette wasn't a trained singer. Her voice cracked on the high notes, but it held a tenderness that made Sophie feel safe. Her father, Monsieur Pierre, worked silently nearby, his broad shoulders hunched as he swung a sickle through the thicker stems. His face, weathered by years under the Provençal sun, was set in a stern line, his graying hair damp with sweat. He rarely spoke during the harvest, his silence a steady anchor amid the bustle. Sophie glanced at him, wondering if he noticed her slowness today. She didn't want to disappoint him. He was the rock of their family, the man who'd taught her to tell ripe lavender by its scent alone. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the family trudged back to their stone house at the edge of the fields. The bells rang out for vespers, their deep, resonant tones echoing through the valley. Inside, the air was cool and thick with the smell of lavender and wood smoke. The kitchen was small but warm, its walls lined with shelves of dried herbs and jars of homemade jam. A wooden table sat in the center, scarred from years of use, and above the fireplace hung a simple cross beside a chipped statue of the Virgin Mary. They knelt together before the hearth, the flickering flames casting shadows across their faces. Monsieur Pierre led the prayer, his voice deep and steady. "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee." Sophie joined in, her small hands clasped tightly, her eyes tracing the Virgin's serene expression. She'd always loved this ritual, the way it tied their day together, a quiet offering to the God who watched over St. Clair. "Sophie, you've learned your prayers well," Madame Juliette said after, ruffling her daughter's curls as they rose. "Father Lyon was proud when you recited them at catechism last week." Monsieur Pierre nodded, a rare smile softening his stern features. "God rewards the faithful, Sophie. Work hard, pray harder. That's how we Moreaus live. Heaven's gates don't open for the idle." Sophie smiled back, though his words settled heavily in her chest, like stones she wasn't sure she could carry. She'd grown up under the village's Catholic canopy, the ancient church with its weathered saints, the long masses thick with incense, Father Lyon's stern sermons about sin and salvation. She knew to pray, to be good, to honor God and her family. But tonight, as she climbed into her narrow bed beneath the sloping roof, a strange tiredness lingered. The lavender-scented breeze drifted through the cracked window, and she whispered, "Dear God, keep us safe." Her eyes fluttered shut, unaware that this harvest season would soon fade into a journey beyond the fields she knew. 3 days later, the golden warmth of the harvest was a distant memory. Sophie lay in her small bed, blankets piled high to her chin, her body trembling beneath them. A fever had taken hold, sudden and fierce, burning through her like wildfire through dry lavender. The room no longer smelled of her mother's bread but was thick with the sour tang of sweat and the faint, desperate murmur of prayers. A single oil lamp flickered on the bedside table, casting long shadows across the stone walls, like ghosts watching in silence. Madame Juliette knelt beside her, her hands trembling as she clutched a rosary, its wooden beads worn smooth from years of use. "Holy Virgin Mary, Mother of God, save my little girl," she whispered, her voice breaking on every word. She pressed a damp cloth to Sophie's forehead, but the heat radiated through it, scorching her fingers. Tears streaked her face, carving paths through the dust of the field still clinging to her skin. She'd seen fevers before. Provence summers often brought them, but this was different, wilder, more relentless. Monsieur Pierre stood in the doorway, his silhouette rigid against the dim light from the kitchen. His fists clenched at his sides, knuckles white, as if he could fight the illness with sheer will. He'd walked the 3 kilometers to the village doctor, Monsieur Lavender, earlier that day, his boots crunching through the dusty lanes. The news he brought back was grim. "It's a bad fever, maybe typhoid. She needs a hospital, but the nearest one's in Ike's, and the truck's broken down." His voice had cracked then, a rare fracture in his stoic armor. Claire, Sophie's 12-year-old cousin who lived with the Moreaus since her parents passed, sat curled in a chair by the window. She clutched a small wooden bird Sophie had carved for her last summer, her green eyes wide with fear. "Will Sophie be okay, Tante Juliette?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Madame Juliette didn't answer, her lips moving faster over the rosary. She couldn't tell Claire the truth, that every shallow breath Sophie took felt like a knife twisting in her chest. Monsieur Pierre stepped forward, resting a heavy hand on Claire's shoulder. "God decides, Claire. We pray and we wait." Father Lyon arrived at dusk, his black cassock sweeping the floor as he carried a vial of holy oil and a worn Bible. His face, lined with age and sternness, softened slightly as he looked at Sophie's frail form. He anointed her forehead with oil, his voice steady as he recited Latin prayers. Per istum sanctum unctionem. The Moreaus stood silently, trusting in the sacred words they didn't fully understand but believed held power. "Have faith in his will," Father Lyon said before leaving, though his tone carried a weight that suggested he doubted a miracle was near. That night the fever raged higher. Sophie no longer stirred at her mother's touch or the cool cloth against her skin. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, her chest aching with every rise and fall. In her delirium she saw fleeting images, lavender fields shimmering under a strange light, the church bells ringing far away, a glow at the edge of the village path. She wanted to reach it, but her body wouldn't move. Madame Juliette gripped her daughter's hand, tears falling onto Sophie's feverish fingers. "Sophie, my heart, don't leave us," she sobbed, her voice raw. Monsieur Pierre turned away, his shoulders shaking as he hid his face. Claire slipped outside, unable to bear the sight, her small figure disappearing into the twilight. As midnight approached, Sophie felt a shift. The burning pain eased, as if someone were gently lifting it away. Her mother's prayers faded to a distant hum, the lamplight dimmed, and she felt herself rising, not from the bed but from her body itself. She opened her eyes, or her soul did, and saw herself below, pale and still, surrounded by her weeping family. Sophie hovered above her bed, weightless, a spectator to the scene unfolding below. Madame Juliette clung to her motionless body, her rosary pressed against Sophie's chest as tears streamed down her face. Monsieur Pierre stood frozen by the wall, his hands gripping the wooden cross so tightly his knuckles bled. Claire had returned, standing at the foot of the bed, her small frame trembling as she stared at her cousin, unable to speak. She wanted to cry out, "I'm here. I haven't gone." But no sound came. She reached for them, or thought she did, but there was no form to her, only a consciousness floating in the cool, still air. Fear gripped her, sharp and cold, yet a strange peace seeped in, like a hand steadying her from within. She couldn't feel her family's grief, only watch it unfold, and that distance tore at her heart. Then it came. A faint glow in the corner of the room, soft as a firefly's light against the Provençal night. It wasn't the harsh flicker of the oil lamp but something gentler, warmer, like dawn breaking over the lavender fields. It grew, spreading into a golden radiance that bathed the stone walls, pulsing with a life Sophie couldn't name. It wasn't blinding but inviting, carrying a love that felt older than the hills outside. She looked back at her family one last time. Madame Juliet's sobs shook her frail shoulders, her father's murmured prayers barely audible, Claire's hands clutching the wooden bird as if it could anchor Sophie to them. She longed to stay to ease their pain. She'd never known a world beyond their love. But the light tugged at her not with force, but with a promise she couldn't resist. A peace that whispered her name. "Do I have to go?" she thought, her young mind wrestling with the pull. The light didn't speak, but she felt a sensation like her mother's arms on a winter night. A quiet assurance. "You're safe." She couldn't fight it, didn't want to. As she let herself drift toward the glow, the room below blurred. Her mother's cries, her father's pleas, the faint creak of the house in the wind. All faded like echoes from a life already slipping away. The light swallowed her whole, warm and complete, washing away every trace of fever, every shadow of fear. She was no longer the sick girl in the bed but part of something vast. A place where love was the air she breathed. The stone house vanished, replaced by a vision of the lavender fields. Not as they were, but endless and shimmering. Their purple blooms glowing under a sky she couldn't name. From within the light, a figure emerged. A woman cloaked in a robe the color of a Provençal spring sky. Her face radiant yet soft, her eyes deep with kindness. Sophie knew her instantly. The Virgin Mary, not the chipped statue on the mantel, but alive, her presence filling the space with a love that made Sophie's heart ache. She wasn't stern or distant, but close like a mother gazing at her child. "Sophie," the Virgin said, her voice gentle as the breeze through the fields. "You've endured so much. Don't be afraid. You're not alone." Sophie stood or floated before the Virgin Mary, time itself seeming to pause in this boundless glow. The space around her wasn't the cramped room of St. Clair but a realm without edges, only light stretching into eternity. The Virgin smiled, and that smile melted every fear in Sophie's young heart, leaving only a quiet wonder. "Where am I, Holy Mother?" she asked, her voice small but clear, echoing in the stillness. "You're in a place where God's love meets you," the Virgin replied, her tone soft as a lullaby. "You've suffered greatly, Sophie, but now you'll see the truth." "What truth?" Sophie tilted her head, her blue eyes wide. She remembered Father Lyon's sermons. God is a judge of sins, heaven earned through good deeds and penance. But here she felt no judgment, only a love so deep it made her tremble. The Virgin raised her hand, and images unfolded before Sophie like a dream painted in light. She saw herself, running barefoot through the lavender fields, kneeling at prayer with her mother, sneaking a taste of jam when no one watched. She saw her fears too, when she'd lied about breaking Claire's toy, when she'd envied her cousin's new shoes. But the Virgin didn't frown or scold. Her eyes remained tender, unwavering. "You think God demands perfection," the Virgin said. "But He doesn't. He seeks your heart, Sophie. The grace of my Son Jesus is a gift, not a prize you must win." Sophie frowned, her brow furrowing. "But Father Lyon says I have to be good, say my prayers, avoid sin. Otherwise I won't reach heaven." The Virgin shook her head, a gentle correction. "Goodness flows from love, not from fear of punishment. My Son has already opened heaven with His love and sacrifice. You need only trust Him and accept it." The images shifted, and Sophie saw a man in a simple white robe standing on a rocky hill. Nails pierced his hands and feet, blood staining the wood of a cross, yet his eyes shone with a love that pierced her soul. She knew him, Jesus, not the stiff figure in the church's stained glass, but alive, His presence overwhelming. Tears welled in her eyes, a mix of sorrow and awe she couldn't name. "Why did He do that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Because He loves you," the Virgin answered, her hand resting on Sophie's shoulder, warm and real. "And because love is the only way to redeem the world." Sophie didn't grasp it all. Her 10-year-old mind struggled with the weight of it, but she felt the truth settle in her chest, a seed taking root. She'd seen God as a distant king, tallying her deeds, but now He was a father, a brother, giving everything for her. The Virgin took her hand, leading her deeper into the light, and Sophie followed, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and longing. The light parted like a curtain, revealing a scene Sophie could scarcely believe. She stood in a field of lavender, but not the familiar rose of St. Clair. These blooms stretched forever, their purple petals shimmering with a glow that seemed woven from joy itself. The air was sweet and alive, filled with a song, not the hymns of Notre Dame, but a melody born of the earth, like wind dancing with water over the hills. Sophie felt weightless, her fever gone. Her fears dissolved into the endless beauty around her. "Where is this?" she asked, her voice odd as she spun to take it all in. "This is heaven," the Virgin said, her tone rich with pride. "Where God's love is whole, where every soul finds rest." Sophie looked around and saw figures, not strangers though she'd never met them here. An elderly woman approached, her face alight with a familiar warmth, her eyes twinkling like stars. "Grandmere," Sophie whispered, recognizing her grandmother, who died when she was 4. Grandmere's arms wrapped around her, strong and soft, smelling faintly of lavender and bread. "You've grown, my little flower," Grandmere said, stroking Sophie's curls. "Isn't God wonderful?" Sophie nodded, tears of joy spilling down her cheeks. She wanted to stay, to sink into this place where pain was a forgotten word, where love was everything. But the Virgin raised her hand, and the scene shifted. The lavender fields vanished, replaced by a barren, shadowed land. The light dimmed to a sickly gray, the air thick and cold, like fog rolling off the Rhone in winter. Sophie shivered, though no breeze touched her. She saw figures, not radiant, not singing, but hunched in silence, their faces etched with regret and longing. The emptiness pressed against her, heavy and suffocating. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice small and trembling. "This is where those who turn from God's love end up," the Virgin replied, her voice tinged with sorrow. "God doesn't cast them here, Sophie. They choose it, rejecting His grace, and this is what remains: darkness without love." Sophie stared at the shadowed souls, her heart aching. A man sat alone, his eyes hollow, as if searching for a light long lost. She wanted to run to him, to pull him free, but the Virgin held her gently. "You can't undo their choices," she said, "but you can offer light to others." "What light?" Sophie asked, turning to her. "The grace of my Son," the Virgin answered. "You've seen heaven in this shadow. What will you choose, Sophie? To stay here, or to return and share this love?" Sophie looked back. Heaven's radiant blooms, the shadows chill, and her family's faces flickering in her mind. She thought of her mother's songs, her father's strength, Claire's quiet trust. "I want to help others," she whispered, her voice firm despite the fear. "But I'm scared." The Virgin smiled, touching her forehead with a warmth that lingered. "Fear not. I'll be with you, and my Son will guide your steps." The light flared brighter, and Sophie felt herself pulled back, away from the fields, a small flame kindling in her heart. When Sophie opened her eyes, the boundless light of heaven was gone, replaced by the dim, flickering glow of the oil lamp beside her bed. The stone walls of the Moreau house pressed in around her, familiar yet strange after the vastness she'd just known. Madame Juliette's sobs filled the air, raw and close, her trembling hands gripping Sophie's as if she might slip away again. Monsieur Pierre knelt by the bed, his head bowed, his rough fingers tracing the edge of the wooden cross he'd torn from the wall. Claire stood in the corner, her green eyes wide with disbelief, clutching the small wooden bird like a lifeline. "Sophie? My little flower, can you hear me?" Madame Juliette whispered, her voice breaking through tears. Sophie nodded weakly, her throat dry as dust, her tongue too heavy to form words at first. She wanted to tell them everything, the light, the Virgin, the lavender fields of heaven, but her body felt like a borrowed shell, her soul not yet fully anchored within it. She wiggled her fingers and Madame Juliette gasped, pulling her into a fierce embrace. "God heard us. Holy Virgin, thank you," she cried, her tears soaking Sophie's nightgown. Monsieur Pierre lifted his head, his stern face softening with a rare, trembling smile. He touched her forehead, his calloused hand cool against her skin. "The fever's broken," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's a miracle, Juliette. She's back." Claire rushed forward, nearly tripping over her own feet, and threw her arms around Sophie. "You scared me, Sophie. Don't ever do that again," she said, her laughter mingling with sobs, her curls brushing Sophie's cheek. The room erupted in a tangle of relief, tears, laughter, prayers tumbling over one another. Monsieur Lefebvre, the village doctor, arrived soon after, his gray hair disheveled from the late-night summons. He examined Sophie with steady hands, his brow furrowing behind thick glasses. "I don't understand," he muttered. Last night her pulse was gone. No sign of typhoid now. It's as if she was never sick. Madame Juliette kissed Sophie's forehead, whispering thanks to the Virgin over and over. Monsieur Pierre stood, vowing to bring a basket of lavender to the church as an offering. But Sophie, lying in her family's arms, felt something deeper than their joy. This wasn't just a healing. It was a return with a purpose, a gift from the Virgin and her son she couldn't yet name. In the days that followed, Sophie recovered with a speed that stunned St. Clair. She no longer lay shivering beneath blankets. She ate her mother's bread, drank cool water from the well, even stepped outside to feel the late summer sun on her face. Madame Juliette hovered, insisting she rest, but Sophie's legs itched to run through the lavender again. Yet inside, she wasn't the same carefree girl. When she closed her eyes, she saw the radiant fields, heard the Virgin's whisper, felt the small flame in her chest. A flame she didn't know how to share. One night, as the house slept, Sophie sat by the hearth, the embers casting a soft glow across her face. The lavender-scented air drifted through the cracked window, mingling with the wood smoke. She whispered into the quiet, "Holy Mother, what do I do now? I'm back, but I don't know where to begin." No voice answered, but a peace settled over her, warm as the fire, as if the Virgin were near, listening. A week after her return, Sophie slipped back into the rhythms of St. Clair, but the world felt different, as if painted in colors she'd never noticed before. The church bells rang each morning, calling the village to prayer, but now they stirred a question in her heart. What does God want from me? She attended Mass with her family on Sundays, sitting on the worn pews of Notre Dame de St. Clair, listening to Father Lyon's deep voice echo off the stone walls. He spoke of sin, penance, the narrow path to salvation, but those words clashed with the love she'd felt in the light, leaving her restless. Madame Juliette noticed the change. "You're too quiet, Sophie," she said one afternoon as they sorted lavender in the kitchen, the air thick with its scent. "You're well now, why do you look so far away?" "I'm fine, maman," Sophie replied, her eyes drifting to the window, where the fields glowed under the sun. She couldn't tell her mother about heaven, the shadow, or the Virgin's call. Not yet. How could she explain what she barely understood herself? One day, while helping Claire feed the chickens behind the house, Sophie wandered into the barn. The air was cool and musty, filled with the smell of hay and old wood. Sunlight streamed through the gaps in the slats, illuminating a dusty shelf in the corner. There, half hidden beneath a tattered blanket, she found a small Bible, its leather cover cracked with age. It must have been Grandmere's. She'd loved reading scripture by the fire before she passed. Sophie pulled it down, brushing off the dust, and opened it to the Gospel of John. "For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son." The words hit her like a sudden breeze, echoing the Virgin's whisper about grace, not rules. She sank into the hay, reading by the thin shafts of light, her fingers tracing the faded ink. Stories of Jesus, healing the sick, forgiving the broken, dying on the cross, brought tears to her eyes. This wasn't the God of Father Lyon's stern warnings, but a God of love who'd opened heaven for her without demanding she earn it. She began sneaking to the barn whenever she could, hiding the Bible beneath a loose plank. At night, when the house grew still, she'd creep out with a lantern, its glow barely enough to read by. The words fed the flame in her heart, but they also brought fear. Monsieur Pierre lived by St. Clair's traditions. Mass every Sunday, confession every month, good deeds to please God. If she told him grace mattered more than rituals, would he call her a fool? Would he burn the Bible she'd come to cherish? One evening, as she sat in the barn, Claire slipped in unnoticed, her shadow falling across the page. "What are you doing out here?" she asked, her voice curious but sharp. Sophie flinched, slamming the Bible shut. "Nothing, Claire. Just thinking." Claire frowned, stepping closer. "You've been strange since you got better, Sophie. If something's wrong, tell me. I'm your cousin, not a stranger." Sophie hesitated, then nodded, her heart pounding. She wanted to trust Claire, her cousin who'd shared every secret since they were small, but the weight of her truth felt too heavy to share just yet. Sophie's secret couldn't stay buried forever. One warm September afternoon, as the lavender fields faded into autumn hues, she met Claire by the village well. The stone basin stood at the heart of St. Clair, its water cool and clear, a gathering place for children after chores. Claire was tossing pebbles into the well, watching the ripples spread, her blonde curls catching the sunlight. "Sophie," she called, spotting her cousin. "You're all better now. I thought you'd never leave that bed. Tante Juliette said you nearly died." Sophie smiled, sitting on the well's edge. "I'm fine, Claire. But I need to tell you something." Claire tilted her head, her green eyes bright with curiosity. "What? Did you find a treasure in the fields?" Sophie laughed softly, then grew serious. She took a deep breath, the breeze carrying the faint scent of lavender to steady her. "When I was sick, I left my body. I saw a light, met the Virgin, and she showed me heaven. She said Jesus loves me, that grace is what matters, not just rules." Claire went still, her pebbles forgotten. She didn't laugh or run as Sophie had feared. Instead, she took Sophie's hand, her grip firm. "I believe you," she whispered. "I don't get it all, but you wouldn't make that up." What else did she say? Relief flooded Sophie as she poured out her story. The light, the cross, the fields of heaven, the shadowed hollow. Claire listened, shivering despite the warm day, her eyes never leaving Sophie's face. When she finished, Claire said, "You're lucky, Sophie. I've never seen anything but this village. If the Virgin told you that, it's real." Claire's trust was a lifeline, a thread pulling Sophie from the loneliness she'd felt since waking. "But I'm scared," she admitted. "If Maman and Papa find out, they'll think I'm mad. Father Lyon might say I'm a heretic." Claire shrugged, a mischievous glint in her eye. "Then don't tell them yet. Figure it out first. I heard there's a group in Les Moulins who pray differently. They don't just recite, they live it. Want to go?" Sophie nodded, her pulse quickening. Les Moulins was the next village over, a short walk through the fields. It felt like a step toward the Virgin's call, but also a step away from the safety of St. Clair. She squeezed Claire's hand, grateful for a friend in this uncharted wind. A few days later, Sophie and Claire slipped away from St. Clair, following the dirt path that wound through the lavender fields to Les Moulins. The sun hung low, casting long shadows over the purple rose, and the air carried a hint of autumn chill. Sophie clutched her small Bible, hidden beneath her sweater, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and dread. Claire walked beside her, humming softly, her confidence steadying Sophie's nerves. They reached a small cottage on the edge of Les Moulins, its stone walls weathered but warm, a wooden cross nailed above the door. It wasn't a church, no steeple, no statues, just a simple home where a group met every Wednesday night. As they stepped inside, a gray-haired woman greeted them, her face creased with kindness. "You must be Sophie," she said, her voice soft like Grandmere's. "I'm Madame Elise. Word travels fast. Your recovery's the talk of the valley." Sophie nodded shyly, taking a seat with Claire on a wooden bench. About a dozen people filled the room, farmers, seamstresses, a young man with a guitar, none wearing vestments or reciting Latin like Father Lyon. They sang a simple French hymn, their voices rising together, then shared stories of Jesus' love. A woman, Madame Clairette, spoke of finding peace after losing her husband, her words raw but hopeful. Sophie listened, her chest tightening. This was the love she'd felt in the light, grace, not judgment, a faith that lived in the heart. When Madame Elise asked, "Would you share, Sophie?" she hesitated, then stood, her voice trembling but clear. "When I was sick, I nearly died," she began. "I saw a light, and the Virgin came to me. She showed me heaven, told me Jesus' grace is for everyone." The room fell silent, eyes wide with wonder. Madame Elise crossed the room and hugged her, whispering, "God chose you, child. We'll help you understand." In the weeks that followed, Sophie returned to Les Moulins whenever she could, sneaking out after supper with Claire as her excuse. She learned to pray not with rote words, but with her soul, whispering to the Virgin and Jesus, asking for courage. The group gave her a sense of belonging, a place where her flame could grow. But she knew this secret couldn't last. The path she walked was widening the gap between her and St. Clair. One evening, Sophie returned late from Les Moulins, her sweater dusted with pollen from the fields. She slipped into the kitchen, hoping to avoid notice, but Monsieur Pierre sat at the table, his hands clasped tightly, his face dark as a storm brewing over the hills. Madame Juliette stood behind him, her eyes red-rimmed, a dishcloth twisted in her hands. "Where were you, Sophie?" Monsieur Pierre asked, his voice low but sharp as a sickle. Sophie froze, clutching her sweater tighter. "I was with Claire, Papa." "Don't lie," he snapped, his fist hitting the table, rattling a clay mug. "Old Madame Dupont saw you heading to Les Moulins. Were you with that strange group?" Sophie's stomach dropped, but she couldn't hide it anymore. "They're not strange, Papa. They believe in Jesus just differently. When I was sick, I saw the Virgin. She told me to share grace, not live by fear." Monsieur Pierre stood, his chair scraping the stone floor, his face red with fury. "The Virgin doesn't speak nonsense. You've been tricked, Sophie. The church is our way." Father Lyon mass confession. "Do you dare turn your back on God?" Madame Juliette stepped forward, her voice pleading. "Pierre, calm down. She's just a child. She doesn't mean harm." "No, Juliette," he roared, his eyes blazing. "She chose this, she faces the cost. If you don't confess to Father Lyon and stop this, you leave this house tonight." Sophie stood rooted, tears streaming down her face. She looked at her father, the man who'd carried her through the fields, taught her to weave lavender into wreaths. "I can't confess a lie, Papa," she whispered. "I love you, but I have to follow the Virgin." Monsieur Pierre turned away, storming out into the night, the door slamming behind him. Madame Juliette sank to her knees, pulling Sophie close. "I don't want to lose you, my flower," she sobbed. "Why can't you stay silent?" "Because I can't pretend, Maman," Sophie said, her voice breaking. "I saw heaven. I can't act like it didn't happen." Claire appeared at the doorway, her face pale. "I don't understand it all," she said quietly. "But if you believe it, I'll stand by you." She took Sophie's hand, a small gesture against the storm brewing around them. That night, as the wind rattled the windows, Sophie lay awake, her father's words cutting deep. The flame in her heart flickered but didn't die. She knew the Virgin had promised to guide her, and she clung to that promise, even as her world began to crack. The air in the Moreau house grew thick with tension after Monsieur Pierre's ultimatum. Sophie still slept in her narrow bed beside Claire, but the warmth of family had chilled. Madame Juliette cooked in silence, her songs replaced by the clatter of pots, her eyes darting to Sophie with unspoken worry. Monsieur Pierre avoided her, spending his days in the fields or the shed, his hammer striking tools with a force that echoed his anger. The church bells of Notre Dame de Sainte Claire rang as always, but to Sophie they sounded hollow, a reminder of the rift widening beneath her feet. Word of her actions spread like wildfire through St. Clair's cobblestone lanes. It began as whispers in the Saturday market, where women bartered lavender oil and gossip with equal fervor. "The Moreau girl claims she saw the Virgin," Madame Dupont murmured, her rosary clicking as she sold jars of honey. "She's gone to Les Moulins with those odd folk," another added, her voice sharp with suspicion. By Sunday, the rumors reached the church steps, where villagers lingered after Mass, their eyes following Sophie with a mix of curiosity and scorn. Father Lyon heard it all, and that morning, his sermon thundered from the pulpit. "Beware those who twist God's truth," he declared, his voice reverberating off the stone arches. "Some among us spread lies, claiming we need no church, no laws. Scripture demands obedience. Stray from it, and you risk damnation." His gaze swept the pews, lingering on the back row where Sophie sat with her mother and Claire. Sophie's heart sank, each word a stone pressing against her chest. She knew he meant her, though he didn't call her name. Madame Juliette squeezed her hand, her grip tight but silent. After Mass, some villagers hurried past, avoiding her gaze while others stared, their whispers trailing behind like shadows. "She's lost her senses," one said. "A child shouldn't defy the church," another muttered. Outside, Claire waited by the church gate, kicking pebbles under an old cypress tree. "You okay?" she asked, her voice low. "I heard Madame Dupont say you're cursed." Sophie forced a smile, though it trembled. "I'm not cursed, Claire, but I don't know what to do. Papa hates me, Maman's scared, and the village thinks I'm mad. I just want to share what the Virgin showed me." Claire's eyes flashed with determination. "Then do it. You're different now, stronger. If the Virgin picked you, you can't hide it forever." Her words were a spark in the gloom. That night, Sophie knelt by her bed, the lavender fields glowing faintly under the moon beyond her window. "Holy Mother, I'm afraid," she whispered, her breath fogging the glass. "But I trust you. Show me how." A quiet strength stirred within her, the flame in her heart flickering brighter. A week later, Sophie could no longer contain the fire within her. It burned too fiercely, urging her to speak, like the wind scattering lavender seeds across the fields. With Claire and Madame Elise from Les Moulins, she planned a gathering by the village fountain, the same well where she'd confided in Claire. Its stone basin gleamed under the afternoon sun, water trickling softly, a familiar spot where St. Clair's children played and women gossiped. Today it would become a stage. Madame Elise brought a few stools from the cottage, Claire convinced some friends from school, and Sophie stood by the fountain, her small Bible trembling in her hands. About 15 people came, Les Moulins folk, a few curious villagers, and Madame Clairette, the widow who'd found peace in the prayer group. As the sun dipped low, casting golden reflections on the water, Sophie took a breath, her voice rising above the murmur of the crowd. "I'm not good at speaking," she began, her eyes meeting theirs, "but I have to tell you what happened. When I was sick I died or nearly did. I saw a light, and the Virgin came to me." She told it all, the fever, heaven's endless fields, the shadowed hollow, the Virgin's message of grace. "I thought I had to be perfect for God," she said, tears glistening on her cheeks. "But He loves us even when we fail. Jesus gave us that love on the cross." The crowd was silent, only the fountain's trickle and the rustle of leaves breaking the stillness. Madame Elise nodded, her eyes shining. Madame Clairette stood, her voice quavering. "I lost my Paul 3 years ago. I thought God hated me. But you, Sophie, you give me hope." She wiped her eyes, a frail smile breaking through. Not everyone stayed. Monsieur Dupont, a burly farmer, stood and left, muttering, "Foolishness. Father Lyon was right." 2 others followed, their footsteps heavy on the path. Sophie watched them go, her heart aching, but she remembered the Virgin's words. "Not all will hear, but so anyway." As the gathering ended, Claire hugged her tightly. "You did it, Sophie. I'm proud," Madame Elise whispered. "You've planted seeds, child. God will water them." That night Sophie lay awake, the fountain's echo in her mind. She'd stepped into the light, but the shadows of St. Clair loomed larger now. The fountain gathering reached Father Lyon and Monsieur Pierre by dawn. The next morning, as Sophie helped Madame Elise dry lavender in the Les Moulins cottage, a heavy knock shook the door. Monsieur Pierre stormed in, his face flushed, his fists clenched as if ready to uproot the fields themselves. Madame Elise stepped back, giving them space, her eyes wary but calm. "What did you do by the fountain?" he demanded, his voice rumbling like thunder over Provence. Sophie set down the lavender, her hands shaking. "I told them about the Virgin, Papa. I wanted them to know grace." He slammed his hand on the table, scattering dried blooms. "You dare shame us in public? Father Lyon came today. Says you're tearing St. Clair apart. Do you want God's wrath on our family?" Madame Elise spoke softly. "Monsieur Pierre, please. Sophie isn't against anyone. She's sharing God's love." "No!" he shouted, his gaze cutting to Sophie. "She chose this path, she pays the price. If you don't confess to Father Lyon and stop, you're no daughter of mine." Sophie stood still, tears falling silently. She saw her father, the man who'd taught her to pray, who'd carried her home when she fell in the fields. "I can't deny the truth, Papa," she whispered. "I love you, but I have to obey the Virgin." Monsieur Pierre turned and left, the door banging shut, leaving a hollow silence. Madame Elise hugged Sophie, murmuring, "God will guide you, little one." That afternoon, Father Lyon arrived at Les Moulins, his cassock stark against the cottage's warm stone. "Sophie," he said sternly, "retract your words before the congregation. You're young, repent and God will forgive." Her heart pounded, but she met his gaze. "I can't, Father. I saw the Virgin, and she told me to speak." His face darkened, his cross glinting coldly. "Then you're no longer welcome in St. Clair's church." He departed, the distant bells tolling like a farewell, their silence settling over her like a shroud. Autumn deepened in St. Clair, and Sophie had no place in the Moreau home. Monsieur Pierre held firm. If she wouldn't renounce her delusions, she couldn't stay. Madame Juliette wept, begging him to relent, but his jaw set like stone. Claire offered her bed, but Sophie knew it would only widen the rift. She packed a small bag, her clothes, the Bible, a lavender sprig, leaving under a sky heavy with clouds. Madame Elise welcomed her to the Les Moulins cottage, her arms open. "This is your home now," she said, her voice steady. Sophie nodded, but her chest ached. She missed her mother's bread, Claire's chatter, even her father's gruff presence. Now, she had only the flame in her heart and the kindness of this new family. She lived quietly in the days that followed, helping Madame Elise with chores, reading scripture by the window as the lavender fields faded to gray. The bells of St. Clair no longer reached her ears, but the rustle of leaves became her hymn. One evening, Claire slipped through the fields with news. "Tante Juliette cries every day, Sophie. She misses you." I told her not to give up. Sophie's tears fell, staining the page she read. "I won't give up, Claire. But I miss them too." Madame Elise sat beside her, her hand warm on Sophie's shoulder. "God's path isn't easy, but He's faithful. Be patient. Your family will see in time." Sophie wasn't sure, but she trusted the Virgin's promise. She gazed at the fields, her footsteps from St. Clair to here etched in her mind. A path she hadn't chosen, but one she walked with purpose. Winter gave way to spring in Provence, the lavender fields stirring with new life under gentle rains. Sophie didn't return to the Moreau house, but she built a home in Les Moulins. Not just the cottage, but a community of those touched by her story. She didn't replace Father Lyon or rebuild a church. She offered a space where grace healed wounds fear had carved. One April afternoon, as Sophie mended a stool in the cottage, Monsieur Pierre appeared at the door. He carried his old pruning shears, his face softer, lines of exhaustion etched deep. "I don't understand you," he said, his voice rough but hesitant. "But I see it in their eyes, those you've helped. I want to hear if you'll let me." Sophie's heart leapt, tears welling. "I've always wanted you here, Papa." She ran to him, her arms wrapping around his broad frame, the scent of lavender and earth pulling her back to St. Clair. Madame Juliette arrived soon after, a basket of bread in her arms, her embrace fierce. "I don't know if you're right," she whispered. "But you're happy. That's enough for me." Claire followed, quieter now, but her questions replaced her silence. A slow opening. St. Clair didn't change entirely. Father Lyon preached on, and many still shunned Sophie. But new paths formed, people seeking freedom and grace, their footsteps joining hers. Claire began teaching village children to read, using Sophie's Bible as a guide. Madame Elise shared her faith with neighboring hamlets, her words carrying Sophie's light. One night, Sophie stood outside the cottage, the stars bright above the fields. She saw the Virgin's glow in her mind, heard her whisper, "I'll be with you." She wasn't perfect. Doubt crept in, exhaustion weighed her down, but fear no longer held her. She'd found truth, and it set her free. She whispered into the night, "Thank you." Under the vast sky, the flame in her heart burned eternal, a bloom that would never fade.